think of a Neanderthal. What do you see? A hunched, hairy brute, maybe, dragging his knuckles on the ground. A club in one hand. He grunts, he stares blankly. He is a caricature of primitive man. A failed experiment in evolution. An evolutionary dead end easily swept aside by the clever, graceful newcomers, our own ancestors. This is the image we all grew up with. It's in movies, in cartoons, in old museum dioramas. It's simple, it's compelling, and it puts us neatly at the top of the ladder. But that image is wrong. It is profoundly, fundamentally wrong. Almost everything you think you know about Neanderthals is likely based on outdated science and a century of prejudice. The story we are now uncovering is far more complex, more nuanced, and much more interesting. It's a story not of a failed species, but of a successful, adaptable, and deeply human population. It's a story that is also, in a very real way, our own. To understand how we got it so wrong, we have to go back to the beginning. The first recognized Neanderthal fossils were found in 1856 in the Neander Valley in Germany. This was 3 years before Charles Darwin published On the Origin of Species. The world was not ready for the idea of other kinds of humans. When scientists looked at the thick brow ridge, the low skull, and the powerful stocky bones, they saw something primitive, something lesser. Some even suggested it was the skeleton of a diseased modern human, perhaps a Cossack soldier from the Napoleonic Wars, who had crawled into the cave to die. The caricature was truly cemented in the early 20th century. A French paleontologist named Marcellin Boule studied a nearly complete skeleton found in a cave at La Chapelle-aux-Saints, France. This individual was old, at least by Neanderthal standards. He had severe arthritis in his spine. He had lost most of his teeth. He was, in short, a mess. But Boule didn't see an old man who had been cared for by his community. He saw the definitive template for the entire species. Boule reconstructed the Neanderthal as a stooped, ape-like creature with a shuffling gait and a dim-witted expression. His head was thrust forward, his knees were bent. This was the caveman of popular imagination. Boule's interpretation was hugely influential. He was a respected authority, and his vision of the Neanderthal as a primitive, beastly failure fit perfectly with the prevailing ideas of the time. The idea was that evolution was a straight line, a ladder of progress, with Victorian European man at the very top. Neanderthals were a lower, discarded rung on that ladder. They had to be brutish to make us look advanced. For decades, this was the accepted truth. Every new discovery was filtered through this lens. Their simple tools proved their lack of intelligence. Their lack of art proved their lack of soul. Their extinction proved their inferiority. The case was closed. And then, slowly at first, and then all at once, the case was reopened. New discoveries, new technologies, and a new generation of scientists willing to look at the evidence without the old biases started to tear the old picture apart. What emerged was a completely different human. Let's start with the most basic thing, their appearance and intelligence. The stooped posture, described by Boule, was a misinterpretation of an individual with arthritis. Healthy Neanderthals stood fully upright, just as we do. They were shorter and stockier than most modern humans, but this was a clever adaptation, not a primitive trait. A compact, muscular body with shorter limbs is much better at conserving heat in a cold environment. And the Neanderthals lived through some of the harshest ice ages Europe has ever seen. Their large, wide noses were likely an adaptation to warm and humidify the cold, dry air they were breathing. They were powerfully built. An average Neanderthal, male or female, would have been incredibly strong, far stronger than the average modern human. And their brains, they were not small. In fact, on average, the Neanderthal brain was slightly larger than the average modern human brain. Brain size isn't a direct measure of intelligence, of course. The structure is also important. But the idea that they were pea-brained simpletons is demonstrably false. Their brains were shaped a bit differently than ours, longer and lower, but they were large and complex. The hardware for advanced thought was there. The proof of that hardware is in what they made. For a long time, Neanderthals were associated with clunky, simple stone tools. But we now know their technology was sophisticated and effective. They were masters of a technique called the Levallois method. This wasn't just about smashing one rock against another. It was a multi-step process that required planning, foresight, and a clear mental template of the final product. Here's how it worked. You would start with a large core of stone, like flint. You would then carefully chip away at the edges, preparing the core in a precise way. It was like sculpting. The final step was a single, precise strike that would break off a perfectly shaped flake, a spear point, a knife, a scraper that was sharp and ready to use. This technique required a deep understanding of the material you were working with. It required the ability to think in 3 dimensions and to plan a sequence of actions to achieve a desired result. And his skill that was likely taught and passed down through generations. This is the work of a skilled artisan, a thinking toolmaker. They also used other materials. We have evidence of them working with wood, though it rarely survives for tens of thousands of years. They made wooden spears sharpened and fire-hardened. They used birch bark tar as a powerful adhesive to attach stone points to those spears. Making this tar is not a simple process. It requires heating the bark in the absence of oxygen at a controlled temperature. It's a basic form of chemistry. They were probably the world's first chemists, creating a synthetic material to solve a problem. But what about culture? What about a mind capable of more than just survival? The old view was that Neanderthals had no art, no symbolism, no spiritual life. That, too, has been completely overturned. One of the most compelling pieces of evidence is their use of pigments. Archaeologists have found dozens of sites with lumps of black manganese and red ochre, a type of iron oxide. These pigments were ground up and likely mixed with a liquid like water or fat to create a kind of paint. What were they painting? Sometimes they used it on tools or animal skins. But there's also strong evidence they were painting themselves. They were using body art. We have found shells with pigment residues which may have been used as mixing pots. Why would you paint your body? For the same reasons humans do today. For ritual. For identity. To signal you belong to a certain group. To prepare for a hunt or a ceremony. It is a symbolic act. It shows an awareness of self and a need to communicate complex ideas visually. They also adorn themselves with jewelry. At a site in Croatia, archaeologists found a set of eagle talons that had been cut, notched, and polished. They were clearly worn as part of a necklace or a bracelet. These weren't just random claws. They were carefully selected and modified. Eagles are powerful, impressive predators. Wearing their talons carries a symbolic weight. It's a statement. In Spain, we found perforated seashells, some of them painted, that were strung together and worn. This wasn't for survival, this was for aesthetics, for self-expression. This is behavior we long thought was unique to our own species. Perhaps the most human thing of all is how they treated their dead. For a long time, it was assumed Neanderthals just died and were left to the elements. But evidence for intentional burial has been mounting for decades. At sites like La Chapelle aux Saints, the same site that produced the arthritic brute, the individual was found in a pit that had clearly been dug for him. He was placed in a sleeping position. This wasn't an accident. He was buried by his people. At another site, Shanidar Cave in Iraq, an individual was found who had suffered a crushing blow to the head when he was young. It would have blinded him in one eye and likely paralyzed his right arm. He also had a withered right leg and may have been deaf. Yet he lived for years with these severe disabilities. He survived into his 40s, a ripe old age for the time. He could not have survived alone. He could not hunt effectively. He could not defend himself. His survival is a testament to the fact that his group cared for him. They fed him. They protected him. They showed compassion. This is not the behavior of a savage every man for himself society. This is the behavior of a community with deep social bonds. The same cave, Shanidar, gave us the famous flower burial. Soil samples taken from around one skeleton contained clumps of pollen from colorful wildflowers. The original interpretation was that this individual had been laid to rest on a bed of flowers, a beautiful, poignant, and deeply symbolic act. This interpretation has been challenged. Some argue the pollen could have been brought in by burrowing rodents. But even if the flower burial itself is debatable, the evidence for intentional burial at many other sites is solid. The act of digging a grave and placing a body inside suggests a sense of loss. It suggests a respect for the deceased. It might even suggest a belief in something beyond death, a kind of afterlife. It is, at its core, a profoundly spiritual and symbolic behavior. The ultimate blow to the idea of the artless Neanderthal came from a cave in Spain. In 2018, scientists used a new dating technique on some of the cave paintings found there, simple red lines, dots, and a stencil of a hand. The results were stunning. The paintings were over 64,000 years old. That's a full 20,000 years before modern humans are thought to have arrived in that part of Europe. The only people who could have made them were Neanderthals. This was the smoking gun. Neanderthals were artists. They went deep into dark caves with only the flickering light of a torch, and they painted on the walls. They made abstract symbols, they marked the world with their presence, and it gets even stranger. Deep inside Brunicle Cave in France, someone 176,000 years ago broke hundreds of stalagmites off the cave floor. They arranged them into two large rings and several smaller piles. They built fires on them. This was a major construction project, undertaken in total darkness, hundreds of meters from the entrance. We don't know why they did it. Was it a ritual space, a shelter, some kind of symbolic structure? And we will probably never know. But we know who did it. The date is far too early for modern humans. It was Neanderthals. They worked together, they had a plan, they imposed order on the natural world, and created something from their imagination. This is one of the most mysterious and compelling pieces of evidence for the complexity of the Neanderthal mind. So, they were intelligent toolmakers, compassionate caregivers, and symbolic artists. What about how they lived day to day? What do they eat? The old picture showed them as clumsy scavengers, picking at the leftovers from other predators. The reality is that they were apex predators, at the very top of the food chain. A chemical analysis of their bones shows that they ate a huge amount of meat. They were expert hunters of large and dangerous animals. They hunted mammoths, woolly rhinos, giant deer, and wild horses. This wasn't reckless, Rambo-style hunting. It was calculated and cooperative. These animals are not easy prey. Hunting a mammoth with a thrusting spear they likely didn't have projectile weapons like bows and arrows is incredibly dangerous. You have to get up close. It requires teamwork, communication, and a deep knowledge of animal behavior. They would likely have used the landscape to their advantage, driving herds into traps or over cliffs. We have found sites with the remains of dozens of animals that were clearly butchered. This was organized, large-scale hunting, but they weren't just meat eaters. A more complete picture is emerging. By analyzing the fossilized plaque on their teeth, a treasure trove of information called dental calculus scientists have found microscopic evidence of what they ate. They found starch granules from cooked barley and water lilies. They found chemical traces of medicinal plants like chamomile and yarrow, which have anti-inflammatory properties. This suggests they had a working knowledge of local plants and may have been self-medicating. Their diet was varied and adapted to the local environment. They ate mussels and seals in coastal areas. They ate nuts, plants, and mushrooms. They were not just brutish carnivores. They were resourceful and omnivorous survivors with an intimate knowledge of their world. This brings us to one of the biggest questions of all. Did they speak? For a long time, the assumption was no. Grunts and gestures were all they were capable of. Language was seen as the final, unbridgeable gap between them and us. But the evidence is pointing in a new direction. Physically, they had the necessary equipment. The discovery of a Neanderthal hyoid bonus, a small bone in the neck that supports the tongue and is crucial for speech, showed that it was virtually identical to our own. This suggests their vocal tract was capable of producing a wide range of sounds. The genetic evidence is also tantalizing. Humans have a gene called FOXP2, which is critical for the development of speech and language. As people with a mutated version of this gene have severe speech problems. When scientists sequenced the Neanderthal genome, they found that Neanderthals had the exact same version of the FOXP2 gene as we do. This doesn't prove they had language, but it means there is no known genetic or anatomical reason why they couldn't have. Consider everything else we now know. Could you organize a mammoth hunt without complex communication? Could you teach a youngster how to make a Levellis point without using words? Could you maintain complex social relationships and care for the sick and elderly with only grunts? It seems unlikely. While we will never hear a Neanderthal speak, it is becoming more and more plausible that they had language. It may have been different from ours, but it would have allowed them to share information, plan for the future, and build a shared culture. So we have this new Neanderthal, intelligent, adaptable, culturally complex, and likely a speaker. This raises a new question. If they were so capable, what happened to them? The old story was simple. Homo sapiens, arrived in Europe around 45,000 years ago. We were smarter, better, and we swiftly wiped them out. It was a story of replacement, of conquest. That story is also collapsing. The first clue that something was different came from our own DNA. In 2010, the Neanderthal genome was sequenced. When scientists compared it to the genomes of modern humans from around the world, they found something shocking. Every person today whose ancestry comes from outside of Africa has a small amount of Neanderthal DNA in their genome. Typically, it's about 1 to 2%. What does this mean? It means our ancestors and Neanderthals weren't just neighbors. They met and they had children together. We interbred. This wasn't a rare one-off event. It happened multiple times in multiple places. The old idea of two separate warring species is wrong. The line between us and them is blurry because, in a small but significant way, they are part of us. Neanderthals did not just vanish, they were in part assimilated into the larger incoming population of modern humans. Their legacy is not just in the fossils and tools they left behind, it is written in the cells of billions of people alive today. That small percentage of Neanderthal DNA is not just junk. Some of it is functional. It has been linked to things like our immune system's ability to fight off certain viruses. It affects our skin's reaction to sunlight and our risk for certain allergies. When our ancestors moved into Europe, they were entering a new continent with new diseases and new environmental challenges. Interbreeding with Neanderthals, who had lived there for hundreds of thousands of years and were already adapted to the local conditions, may have given our ancestors a crucial survival advantage. It was a genetic shortcut to adaptation. This changes everything. Neanderthals are not an evolutionary dead end. They are part of the great braided stream of human ancestry. They are our ancient cousins, and their story is a chapter in our own. But this still leaves the question of their extinction as a distinct population. They disappear from the fossil record around 40,000 years ago, just a few thousand years after modern humans became widespread in Europe. If it wasn't a simple case of us killing them all, what happened? There is no simple answer. Most scientists now believe it was a perfect storm of factors, a slow-motion collapse rather than a single, dramatic event. The world they lived in was changing rapidly. The climate during that period was wildly unstable, swinging back and forth between cold and warm periods. This would have put immense pressure on the animal herds and plants they relied on. The Neanderthal population was always small. Genetic evidence suggests their total population at any given time may have been only a few tens of thousands, spread out over a vast area from Spain to Siberia. They lived in small, isolated groups. And then we arrived. Homo sapiens seem to have lived in larger groups with more extensive social networks. This might have given us an edge. If one group was struggling, they could rely on connections with other groups hundreds of miles away. Neanderthals seem to have been more locally focused. We also may have had a slight reproductive advantage. If our women had slightly more children who survived to adulthood over thousands of years, the population numbers would slowly but surely shift in our favor. It may not have been open warfare, it might have been simple competition. Imagine two groups living in the same valley. The modern human group is a bit larger and has a slightly more diverse diet. They are better able to weather a tough winter. The Neanderthal group, already stressed by the changing climate, is slowly pushed to the margins. Their hunting grounds shrink. Their population dwindles. Some of them leave. Some of them die out, and some of them join the newcomers. A young Neanderthal woman finds a mate in the human camp. Her children grow up as part of that group, carrying her DNA with them. Repeat this process over 1,000 valleys for 5,000 years. It's not a dramatic story of conquest, it's a slow, quiet story of demographic pressure, climate stress, and assimilation. The Neanderthals didn't so much lose as they were simply absorbed. Their gene pool was diluted into the much larger one of modern humans. They faded away as a distinct people, but their genes lived on. So is everything you know about Neanderthals wrong? If you still picture the dumb, club-wielding brute, then yes, that idea is dead. It was a product of a different time of scientific arrogance and a need to see ourselves as the pinnacle of creation. The real Neanderthal is infinitely more compelling. They were survivors. They thrived for hundreds of thousands of years in a brutal, unforgiving world. They were intelligent. They planned, they innovated, they solved complex problems. They were social and compassionate. They cared for their sick and their old. They had a symbolic world. They created art and jewelry, and they buried their dead. They were not a failed experiment. They were a different kind of humanity, a successful and parallel track of human evolution. Their story is a powerful reminder. It reminds us that we were not always alone on this planet. For most of our history, we shared the world with other kinds of humans, and their story reminds us that the line between success and failure in evolution is incredibly fine. They were not inferior. They were just on the wrong side of a series of environmental and demographic shifts. A slight change in the climate, a slightly different social structure, a slightly lower birth rate over the vast timescale of prehistory, these small things can make all the difference. The Neanderthal is not a caricature to be laughed at. They are a mirror. In them, we see a different path that humanity could have taken. Or we see intelligence and creativity in a form that is not quite our own. And in our own DNA, we see the undeniable proof that their story and our story are, in the end, the same. They are the most intimate of our lost relatives, gone but not entirely erased.